Okay, let's get started. I'd like to welcome everybody. This is our grand rounds, and we've had a series of named lectureships recently, and this is ours, and I just want to tell you a little bit about it. This is actually our, hard to believe, our 22nd Yokelson lecture here, and the family of Samuel and Catherine Yokelson endowed this lectureship in around 1980, and we have had a series with a little bit of a gap where the endowment was invested and raised some extra money with the good Yale investors, so that we have expanded the lectureship to be a week-long invitation to someone to come and do not only a grand rounds here, but to do a grand rounds at Connecticut Valley Hospital, and to do a case conference up there, and to do several case conferences down here. And also we've had this year an expansion to have our Dr. Bradford do a meeting on PTSD, what he's going to talk about here, with court personnel, judges and people who work in the courts, where this is also a significant issue. So let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Yokelson, and then I'm going to have his daughter come up and say a few words about the family. But he went to Yale here and got a PhD, and then got a medical degree, and became a psychiatrist and worked in Buffalo for a while, and then went down to Washington, D.C., where he spent a number of years trying to understand and sort out issues that had to do with the criminal personality, first beginning with a psychoanalytic method, and then began to feel that most of what he heard was not really very reliable, and then worked to codify it into how criminals thought, and developed several volumes with Stanton Saminow to do that. So he did that in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, and they studied 255 hardcore male criminals. Took over 17 years, 8,000 hours on each individual, and as you can see, several 100,000 pages of notes. So the original stuff was scrapped and redesigned, and that's what resulted in the volumes. These are the family members, and they have been very devoted to this and have come every year. Catherine came until the year she died, basically, and was very involved with all of this. These are the past Yokelson invitees, and it's an impressive list of people who have made major contributions in the field of forensic psychiatry. But before I get into John's bio, let me have Bonnie come up and say a few words.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Yokelson. I'll be real quick. This is very impromptu. I was just told to do this. But I drove up from New York this morning, and as I was doing, I thought of what I think is an amusing story about my dad to tell you all, which is, first of all, to put into context, we moved from Buffalo to Washington in 1961 when he was 54. So he spent most of, the bulk of his career as a general practitioner at the private practice, doing a lot of interesting things. So I was recently going through some family papers and came across something that I wanted to share with you, which was amazing. It was an announcement for a lecture. It had a picture of him in uniform because he had been in the Army during the war as a psychiatrist. That was the headshot for this, and it was an announcement for a lecture on, it was 1949, on the just published Kinsey report on, what's it called, male sexuality, that he was giving to the Toronto Lodge of the B'nai B'rith Center. So, I mean, talk about worlds colliding. And it was for men only, but then it said, bring your friends. So it was just an amazing object to come across. And it's just like, this is so surreal. I like sent a snapshot of it to my whole family just as for fun. But then I got to thinking about it, and I realized that it was actually an interesting kind of window into my dad's psychological, sort of intellectual framework, and also his ambition, which is to say that, somebody at 54 who starts over essentially in a government with a government research grant, and with the end goal of writing a 3-volume work on criminal personality. I mean, he is of a certain generation and frame of mind, he was, to kind of look at the biggest picture, and also, to feel that he, out of, his individual work, could have something to say about the whole subject. So that's my story. I mean, it just, in a way, it sort of dates him of being a sort of mid-20th century thinker, but, so it's kind of amazing that there are people still find some use in his books. But anyway, so that's my anecdote, and I thought you would enjoy getting a little sense of him as a person. And I also, since I'm here, want to thank Howard and everyone for coming, and this whole project. We gave basically a quite modest gift in the 80s, and thanks to Howard and his vision, has been able to turn it into something really meaningful for the program, and we really enjoy having this as part of our lives too. So thank you.
Okay, let me just run through this briefly because you want to hear John and not me. These are his current titles, his varying professorship titles that are current in a number of places. He's now at McMaster after having been a good part of his career in Ottawa. His background is that he grew up in Cape Town and went to medical school there, and did a psychiatry residency, and then went to Britain at the Maudsley in forensic psychiatry. And then after that is when he went to Canada. He's been a national, international leader in the field of forensic, especially in the area of sexual paraphilias and issues surrounding that. And has a number of impressive titles, which I have here, and he's worked on both the DSM and the ICD classifications of sexual disorders. He's the editor of 5 books, refereed chapters in 53 books, 145 papers in refereed journals, and another abstracts at meetings that have been reviewed. So I would say, let's have John come up and do his thing.
Make sure this is working. Can you hear me?
Whoops.
Yeah? All right.
Let me try the other one.
So just while we're waiting for Howard to find my slides, first of all, I'd like to say I'm honored and very grateful for the opportunity to the Jochelson family. And I met John last night and had a wonderful dinner. It's been a privilege to be here. I've made new friends, seen many old friends, and the forensic or law and psychiatry division here is terrific with its camaraderie, and I think that's a major credit to Howard and all of you, because it seems as though it's a wonderful place to work, and it seems as though everybody's really happy. So thank you, guys. Okay. What I'm going to talk about is about a personal experience. I could have talked about lots of other things, but I thought that this is something that I have been talking about, and I think it's important enough to share with you people, because I think most of us as forensic mental health professionals are vulnerable to some degree. So I'm going to talk about my lived experience, share that with you, and we will hopefully be able to have a discussion and some questions afterwards. Just on a timing issue, I go through till when? 11:30 or so. Okay, good. All right. So, bringing light into the darkness, or bringing light in the darkness. Michael Norco organized a President's Symposium at the APA last year, I think it was, Michael. And there were a number of difficult subjects that were discussed. I got stuck in a windstorm in Toronto. I never got there, although I was on the other end of a phone or whatever it is. But I think it is important to discuss things, just as I think, having an intensive case series, such as in Dr. Jochelsen's book, which I think is is an important part of how we learn about things. So, for example, when I looked over the book, and then I'm a great fan of Psychopathia Sexualis as well, which is an intensive case history, and I'm also a fan of single case studies with repeated measures, as opposed to RCTs, most of which you can never actually do properly. That aside, I think that's a discussion for another time. So, I was in South Africa. Went to the Maudsley, and then I was going to stay in the Institute of Psychiatry, and for various reasons decided to go west. And west was to the United States or to Canada, and I ended up going to Canada. And when I was working at the Maudsley, I was doing sex offender research. We were using estrogens to treat people that were sexually violent. We started to use an anti-androgen called cyproterone acetate, which I don't think has ever been available in the United States. And that was really mostly what I was doing. I was also a sort of pair of hands in interesting experimental work we were doing. We were giving people with Parkinson's disease intravenous dopamine, which made them all crazy and hypersexual, which I found interesting. And stuff like that, intravenous antipsychotics, et cetera, and we were doing some studies on Korsakoff psychosis with high levels of thiamine, which I tried to continue in Canada, and I did a study of HLA antigens in what was then known as atypical psychosis, which today would be schizoaffective disorder. But I sort of developed an interest in deviant sexual behavior. So when I came to Canada, I started a sexual behaviors assessment clinic, a research clinic, which I've done lots of work on and continue to do that. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about a lived experience as a forensic psychiatrist, which is sort of related to that career, and tell you what happened to me, and maybe we can share experiences. I'm going to talk about my exposure to traumatic material as part of my work and the impact that it had on me. So when I came to Ottawa in 1978, I had never seen snow. Even in England, I saw a couple of sprinkles of snow. England, by the way, it rains in the summer as well. I've never seen anything like that. The sun's shining and it's raining. But anyway, but then I came to Canada, and I think when I arrived in Ottawa, it was in the end of February, and the temperature was minus 22 centigrade, which I thought was a mistake, but I found out afterwards it wasn't. And I then ended up in a program where we had no forensic beds, if we needed to admit anybody, we had to borrow a bed out of a schizophrenia program, and I started off a career. And when I left England, I was told that your sex research will probably grind to a halt because Canadians are such lovely people and they're not deviant like the Brits. And I've been pleasantly surprised and had a lot of dinners and things on the basis of that experience. But my first evaluation was, my first forensic evaluation was an evaluation where a young man, a student at Carleton University, God forbid not Ottawa University, we had two in Ottawa. Carleton's got a law school but not a medical school. And he was charged with disturbing the peace. And the problem was he had 2 sheep in his bedroom and they were making a noise. And the other problem was that he was having sex with the sheep. That was my introduction to Ottawa and a case of bestiality. And I've said, and in the Ottawa Valley, so when we talk about Ottawa and the Ottawa Valley, the people in the valley are supposed to be not as sophisticated as the people in Ottawa, so there's always sort of pejorative comments made about people in the valley. My best friend is from the valley, and he's the one that said it's the Ottawa Valley where men are men and sheep are nervous. So, okay, having said that, what's happening here? Okay, this seems to have ground to a halt here somehow. Pardon? All right, no, it's not working. I think it's frozen. Oh, there we go. All right.
Just push that one. Try it.
Well, let's see if it's working. Okay, it's working. So, if you're in Africa, and I'm just talking about the big sort of national park in South Africa, which is Kruger National Park, that you go there and the kinds of experiences you have, you see, and these are pictures taken at Kruger, and you see real life animals, you see vistas like this with elephants at watering holes, and it's really an experience which you'll never forget. So when I came to Canada, I heard about Algonquin Park, which is about 3 hours north of Toronto, about 5 hours or so from Ottawa, a massive park. So I rushed off with my family that summer to go and see Canadian wildlife, wolves, whatever, bears and everything else. And what I saw was 2 ducks and a squirrel. So great disappointment, never recovered from that. No, I'm just teasing. Okay, so now just to talk about the more serious issues. So occupational stress injury, any type of trauma, is a problem for many professionals. It's not just us, and I often have been talking to groups, judges and others about their exposure to trauma. But this includes first responders, which I think are particularly vulnerable, and I've worked with a number of them in Canada to improve their disability, and certainly in Ontario, from only the last couple of years, occupational stress injury is a recognized disability for first responders, except nurses, which we're still working on. So it's even you would think in 2017 we would be at the situation to understand that trauma related to what you do as a job in the service of others can also harm you. But it took quite a lot to get it accepted. The legal profession, judges, lawyers, prosecutors, defense counsel, and the lay public, and particularly jury members, are exposed to material that can be really problematic. As far as PTSD is concerned, it's a serious public health problem. Overall prevalence rates range from about 8.8% in the US. There's some studies that actually have it higher than that, and about 1.3 in a European sample. I think part of that is because you have a significant number of veterans, which may make the difference. It has significant emotional, suicidal, interpersonal, psychosocial costs that are substantial. First introduced as a diagnosis in DSM-3, and since then has gone through some iterations, with the latest one in DSM-5, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I suggested this article simply because it's one of the best reviews available, and we have a chair in trauma at McMaster, and this is the one that they recommend, Margaret McKinnon. So, and I think I sent it, so it probably is available. If not, you can look at it. Okay, so what about my experience? Well, my experience was related to two very serious problems of sexual violence, the perpetrators Paul Bernardo and Russell Williams. So in September 2010, I received a court-ordered request for an evaluation of Colonel Russell Williams. Russell Williams was very interesting. He was second in command of the Canadian Air Force. He spent a lot of his career in some of our secret bases in the Middle East. He was under a lot of scrutiny. He'd been in the military from 21 years of age. He had an exemplary career. But what happened was, when he was in his late 40s, he went off the rails, and there were some significant medical issues which are not in the public domain, so that I can't talk about them necessarily. But it was one of these cases, an extremely high-profile case. It was a court order for me to see him, and as often happened, the Royal Ottawa is a large tertiary care hospital with the Institute of Mental Health Research. You don't walk in Russell Williams or anybody else that's all over the paper in the middle of the day. Most of these evaluations I did at night, sometimes from 8 p.m. at night till 2 a.m., to avoid any public scrutiny and the media. And this was the same in this case, and there's also significant pressure to get them done as soon as possible. There were some similarities to this case, which I'll talk about in a moment, but I was involved in the case of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. Paul was an accountant. He lived in Scarborough. When he was an adolescent, he would go out at night, supposedly to collect earthworms, which he would then sell to get money. But while he did that, he also became a voyeur, and he went around through all the backyards in Scarborough, where he would peep through windows, mostly at young adolescents. Now, he was adolescent then, but anybody he saw who was getting undressed, and he had a vast knowledge of all the backyards in Scarborough, a suburb of Toronto. And he then, at a certain point, became what we subsequently talked about as the Scarborough rapist. And he committed something like about 50 serial rapes. His modus operandi was that he would go to he knew Scarborough so well, he would go out at night. He would look for young women who were alone at a bus stop. He would abduct them, take them into areas which were secluded within the backyards of Scarborough, and commit very serious violent sexual acts on them. He didn't kill anybody, however, although it was clearly very sadistic, coercive sexual violence. He met Carla Homolka, and that's a picture of Carla there. And what happened after that was they became involved in which is really was a lethal couple. There's no other way to describe it, which led to the death of 3 young women. The first person who died was Carla Homolka's sister, and Carla worked as a veterinary assistant, and as a result of that, she had halothane, because halothane is used in euthanasia or in veterinary technicians' work and veterinarians' work. And she used halothane to drug her younger sister, who was a virgin, to offer her sister to Paul Bernardo, which she did. And then after that, they abducted 2 other young women, and one of them was mutilated and encased in concrete after she was killed and dumped in a lake. Another one was strangled and left next to the side of the road. The Scarborough police had picked up the DNA and they had made a connection with Bernardo. It was almost a spurious connection, and they bumped into the St. Catherine's police. Homolka and Bernardo had a house in St. Catherine's, and when they met up, 2 and 2 sort of added up to 4, and the St. Catherine's police were looking for 2 young women who were missing, and they then went and arrested Paul Bernardo. When they looked at the house in St. Catherine's, they couldn't find any evidence, no DNA or anything else, blood splatter, anything that would even show that the 2 young victims, Leslie Mahaffey and Christian French, were even in the house. What happened after that was I was retained by the Crown Attorney. They were very concerned about getting a conviction. I had been involved in a case previously related to a sadistic, sexually motivated homicide. I hadn't examined somebody, but my research and other evidence in terms of being able to give an opinion was supported by the Crown, Court of Appeal, and then the Supreme Court of Canada. So I was retained by the Crown that I could give, it was clear that Bernardo wouldn't come anywhere near any court-ordered evaluation, and so that the Crown retained me, that if necessary, that evidence from my profiling, if you like, would be accepted. In the interim, however, Carla Homolka pleaded that she was a battered woman, that she was abused by Paul Bernardo, and that he was responsible for all of the activity. What we didn't know at that time was that Mr. Bernardo's lawyer knew that everything that they had done was videotaped. And the police had gone through the house and almost dismantled it, but they never found the videotapes. Subsequently, the videotapes came into the possession of the lawyer. This was after Homolka had pled to 3 counts of manslaughter, and she was then going to be a witness against Bernardo. The videotapes showed clearly that she was a participant. She was responsible for the drugging, and she was responsible, for example, of the abduction of Christian French, who was very streetwise. Miss Homolka was very good looking, dressed very well, and when they stopped next to Christian French, she got out of the car and went across and persuaded Christian to come across the road to help them to look at a map, and then pushed her in the car and was abducted and subsequently killed. At a certain point, and this was after the videos became available, John Rosen, who was a very experienced criminal legal counsel, done probably more than 100 homicides at that point, contacted me and asked me if I would help him. Not that Bernardo was not guilty, but the fact that his partner had made a plea deal, which now was complete nonsense when the videotapes were out. He wanted my help, first of all, to analyze the videotapes and to help him as he dealt with it, his subsequently, the criminal proceedings against Paul Bernardo. Pat Lesage was the Chief Justice of Ontario at that time. I went to Superior Court in Toronto on University Avenue. He gave me the videotapes, and I went back to Ottawa, where I was responsible for their safekeeping. There were concerns that they may be stolen and used as, quotes, not sexually violent videos that could get a lot of money on the black market. I spent probably about 100 hours looking at the videos, and I then helped Mr. Rosen in terms of dealing with Bernardo and Homolka, and they tried to get her plea struck and things like that. What happened was, when I viewed the videos, and I'm not going to talk about what's actually in them out of respect for the victims, other than to say that there was extreme sexual violence and violence in the videos. something which most people would never see under normal circumstances. The other thing about the emotional impact of the videos was that this is not like something you see on television. This is real life, and you know what the end run is. You know what the end point is. You know what's going to happen. And although at the time I thought I was really tough, and this was just something as part of my work as a forensic psychiatrist, I had trouble with the videos, and afterwards, for probably a period of 3 to 6 months, I had these videos completely playing in my heads with both the pictures, particular scenes, and the audio that went with them. And I felt almost tortured by this. It was tough for me to go to sleep. I'm not somebody that sleeps that much. I mean, now I sleep more, but then I'd probably sleep the most 4.5 hours a night. I probably went down to 2 hours a night, mostly because if I was falling asleep, I would have these flashbacks in my mind from these videos. And so what I did was stayed up later and later, so when I went to sleep, I would be exhausted, and I wouldn't have to go through that process. I knew it was a problem. I kind of minimized it at that time, and then what I did was it eventually faded over a period of time. Then came along Russell Williams. And what Russell Williams did was, and I'm hopefully in the future going to be able to write extensively about this, because it's actually quite interesting from a medical standpoint. He pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. But what happened was, this is one of the victims, that's another one. He was a man who, as I said, had an exemplary record, and at a certain point in his life, he started to break into houses in the East End of Ottawa and steal the underwear, mostly of adolescent girls. And he developed a whole collection, and eventually, when this was all analyzed, he'd broken into something like 85 houses. And he had a massive collection of juvenile girls' underwear. He, at that time, was in charge of Trenton, which is the main Air Force base, and anything to do with Iraq or anything else would fly into Trenton. So he was the commander at the base, and I think he was second in command of the Canadian Air Force at that time. He had a cottage, so his wife lived in Ottawa, he was married without any children, and he was in Trenton about an hour and a half away. And they had a cottage which was about not quite halfway, between about 60 kilometers from Trenton. And he would go to the cottage, and this cottage was on a lake, and what started to happen on the cottage area was that women who were alone, somebody broke in while they were asleep, tied them up, blindfolded them, undressed them, took pictures of them in various sexual poses, and sexually assaulted them short of sexual intercourse. And about 6 or so women were subjected to that. A young woman who had been an air hostess on the special jet that Colonel Williams drove VIPs around in Canada disappeared, didn't come to work. And when they went to her house, they found her dead, and there was really not good evidence of a break and enter, and it was a mystery about what had actually happened. She had been bludgeoned to death, and there was evidence of sexual assault. There was then the other young woman who was found dead in her home, very similar circumstances. And Russell Williams was caught because where her home was, which was near a highway, they noticed that there was a Nissan SUV parked in a field next to it. And SUVs are parked in fields in Canada when there's a hunting season, but not many people do it when there's not a hunting season. And 2 hunters thought that it was strange. And when news of Miss Lloyd's death came, they went to the police, they set up a roadblock, and there were special tire tracks, and Colonel Williams arrived, and based on the tire tracks, they arrested him, and he confessed shortly afterwards. Russell Williams's hobby was photography. So he had high-definition cameras with Dolby sound, and he had hours of recordings of what he had basically done. So there were still pictures and recordings. As part of the assessment, near the end of the assessment, I went to the Ontario Police Headquarters, where I was granted access to these videotapes to review them, and spent the best part of a day looking through these videotapes. Immediately the videotapes came on and I was subjected to the material. I felt extremely uncomfortable, nervous. I felt stressed. I had to, because I was compelled to look at them, saw the videos through, and when I left there, within a short period of leaving, probably about half an hour on the 5-hour drive back to Ottawa, I had what I'll describe as an emotional storm, which in technical terms would be an acute stress reaction. I started to cry uncontrollably. I was shaking. I couldn't drive. I went into really a profound negative state, which I didn't quite understand at that point, where I felt my whole life was a failure, that what am I doing, what I was doing? And I sort of pulled myself together, managed to get back to Ottawa, and I then had very similar experiences related to, very similar to what I'd had with the Bernardo tapes, except much worse. So what was happening was the fidelity of these tapes and actually the content of them were worse, and as a result of that, I struggled with the same difficulty to the point where, I knew I had a problem, but I was in some level of denial. I then had to go and testify in a dangerous offender hearing, which is the equivalent of a sexually violent predator hearing. And this had about 24 hours of videotape material of a man sexually abusing a 14-year-old girl and also sexually abusing his partner when she was unconscious. And I had done that evaluation about 10 months before the Russell Williams episode, and I got a phone call from the Crown, equivalent of the district attorney here, to say that there's been a recent ruling in the Supreme Court of Canada that he had been warned that the defense counsel was going to make an argument that his girlfriend, although conscious, had consented before these horrendous acts were committed on her, and he wanted me to go back and look at the videotapes because this person had indexed the videotapes around issues of consent. I struggled to look at those videotapes. It was absolutely horrific. I spent, I think it was Easter weekend, going through these, and my concentration was awful. I became more and more agitated and anxious. My sleep got worse. I actually became tearful and emotionally labile. And then when I went to court on the next week, the examination in chief went okay. The cross-examination, I was extremely irritable. It wasn't particularly penetrating cross-examination. I'd done it many times before, but I was saying things in my head, this guy is an idiot, da-da-da-da-da, but I nearly blurted it out in court. So I almost lost control of that. Then I realized I had a problem. So what happened was, when I went back, I went and saw some of my colleagues. I went to see people that I work with at the hospital, and I then realized I had a problem, that I needed help. The Ontario Medical Association has an excellent physician help program. The head of it was a person who was a resident in our program and had then graduated to be the vice head of that program. I spoke to her, spoke to the people in the hospital, and went off to see Professor George Fraser, who was actually a good friend of mine, professor at the University of Ottawa and Canada's expert on PTSD at that time. And he worked with Dr. Welburn, a psychologist. They worked together as a team and they evaluated me, and basically, as a result of the test, the better part of a day, etc., that high visual imagery and empathy, which I had both, never thought about it until I ran into this difficulty, made me quite vulnerable to trauma that in this case was occupationally stress related. And so I'd also had something that was a little bit odd, and all of us are different. So when we're exposed to occupational stress injuries, if we have a previous history of childhood trauma or life trauma, we're all vulnerable in different ways. I'd always had a photographic memory and high visual imagery as a result of that, which was great when I was at medical school. I didn't have to work as hard as some other people because I could remember things and see them in my head. But what I didn't realize until I saw these guys was that when I remembered things, and particularly video, I also remembered the audio. So when I had the videos running in my head, it was also the audio that was going with it. And that was a tremendously traumatic experience for me. And once I realized that, I then knew that I had some pretty serious difficulties. And although it was unique to me, I needed help. Doctors are terrible patients. I was probably the worst. George arranged for me to go to Mount Sinai in Toronto, to the Anxiety Disorders Clinic. The head of the clinic was, again, somebody who'd come through our program, a very accomplished woman, and she was great. She spent a day with me, going through my symptomatology, what I needed, and at the end of it, though, and she said, you need to get into treatment. I'll arrange treatment for you in Ottawa, wherever you want, and she outlined a course of treatment, and in my denial at that point, I said, no, I'll be okay. This happened before with the previous videotapes. I'm sure I will be okay. Don't worry. And if I'm worried, I'll come back. That was probably one of the biggest mistakes I made in my life. Over the next year, I had a profound negative emotional state. And I say that because if you talk about PTSD and depression, people get a bit muddled. Yes, it was depression. It was very serious depression. And it got worse and worse and worse. And although I got away with things at work in terms of performance, my performance would have dropped off because, for example, on various committees and things, I was missing deadlines, which is something I'd never did, right? So but I was kind of bright enough or hit it enough so nobody could really pick it up. And I was also working in administration, probably 2.5 days a week. And although I was probably a little bit more grumpy in administration than I'd been previously, I was able to hide what was really going on. Things at home were different. I was not easy to live with. I ended up splitting with my wife. We never got back together since then. And my emotional lability was really problematic. I would, when we'd have people around for dinner, the joke was that I would have 2 glasses of wine and say I'm going to the washroom and then go and have a nap because I fell asleep. Now there was a complete change. If I had 2 glasses of wine or 3 glasses of wine, I was completely argumentative. I would break down into tears. Completely different from the rest of my life. There had been a significant change. Again, I just kind of denied it, put it down to work stress, and my wife left me. I was on my own. I sort of thought it had to do with other things and took no real responsibility for it. And over the next 12 months, got worse and worse and I spoke to some people who were picking up, when I was more honest, they were worried about me, 2 colleagues particularly. But I kind of ignored them. And then my daughter she'd finished her PhD in clinical psychology. I went to see her in Montreal. She was at McGill doing an internship. Went to see the movie Lincoln, which is a miserable, depressing movie, even if you are normal, and I wasn't. And that pushed me over the edge. I'm joking, but it's true. And when I drove back from Montreal, and it was interesting, all of us have suicidal thoughts. For the first time, I felt compelled to kill myself. And it was really methodical. I mean, I thought to myself, if I'm going to do this, I've got to make sure I do it properly. And I thought about, I've always had fancy cars and I drive fast, so I was looking at bridges, about driving into a bridge and, try and hit the bridge at 160 kilometers an hour. And, I wouldn't write a note. My family would benefit from, I thought it all out. But my biggest worry was that I might not do the job properly. In other words, I might end up as having some kind of level of paralysis or traumatic brain injury, but not die. I went home, and this is all sort of in the same 24-hour period. And I got home, and I took a block heater cord out of the garage, tied it with another one, sort of got it on the banister of the double-story house that I lived in on the St. Lawrence River at that time, and again I was about to start a suicide note at that point, and I was ambivalent about that, but I thought if I hang myself, it's pretty obvious that nobody else had anything to do with it. And the phone went, and it was my wife's best friend, who had no reason in the world to phone me. I still to this day think it's almost fatalistic that this happened. And she phoned me and she said, she's English. And Elizabeth phoned me, Beth phoned me and said, Johnny had a bad feeling about you. I'm not sure why. I know you and Jill have had problems. I just wanted to phone you to make sure you're okay. And that broke the kind of spell that I was in. And then my daughter phoned within 15 minutes, and that got me out of that haze. I phoned some friends of mine, and I basically went back to see George, who blasted me for about 6 hours, threatened to certify me, and on, and I got into treatment with medication and cognitive behavioral treatment. So, why is this relevant? Well, it is relevant because, I learned a lot about PTSD that I didn't know at that point, and I suspect a lot of you don't know as much as I didn't know at that point. But the amazing thing for me was that in my work with sexual violence, we were working at this time with virtual reality. So we had avatars, and we had people in a virtual reality laboratory committing sexually motivated homicides and measuring arousal. I knew from all my background in measuring sexual arousal that videotapes are extraordinarily powerful, and in terms of sexual arousal. I never for once sort of put that together with me looking at videotapes that they would have this profound effect on me. Well, as you probably know, it's now part of, so when you look at PTSD and you look at the criterion A, exposure to actual threat and death, serious injury, sexual violence in one or more of the following ways, what has now been added is exposure to electronic media, because there's been increasingly evidence of the experience that I've had, right? And it's not just, looking at videotapes. It's other material, it's audio tapes, it's childcare workers listening to children being interviewed that are victims of sexual abuse, and on and on and on. Also, just about everybody has, a camera in their phone that takes high definition photography. They take all kinds of pictures of all kinds of things. You can go on the internet and see people being beheaded, and on and on and on. And the actual impact of this high digital media on certain people, even outside of the occupational stress injury issue that I'm talking about now, I think we are still going to have to evaluate. So that was an important lesson for me. And then because of that, I had, and I have been since that time, talking to firefighters, correctional officers, police, nurses, and many people, including judges and juries, are very important parts of this equation. In fact, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was part of a panel with I gave a talk, and then there was a panel with Justice Patrick Lesage, who was the Chief Justice of Ontario, he presided over the Bernardo trial. And the Bernardo trial, the videotapes that caused the first difficulty for me were not played to the audience in the courtroom, but they were played to the jury and to Justice Lesage. And I knew that there had been problems, but I now had a more vested interest. There were 2 police officers that never recovered from their exposure to the videotapes, as far as I'm aware. One of the lawyers, a female lawyer I did some work with, I didn't even know, she was off work for 12 years. And when I bumped into her when I did bump into her after about 12 years, she was barely working part-time, and she was tortured by these videotapes to the point her whole life was turned around, couldn't recover. Justice Lesage at the National Judicial Council talked about his own experience, and essentially was the trauma that he had endured as a result of looking at these videotapes. A number of the jurors the government was ordered to provide them with treatment and assistance because of their exposure. I'm proud to say now that both in the province of Ontario and also there's federal legislation coming in that to protect jurors who are trying to do their civil duty, who can be exposed to this kind of material which could change their lives forever. So the government will, first of all, will allow people, if they feel vulnerable in any way, to remove themselves. And if they do suffer any harm, occupational stress injury kind of harm as a result of their civil duty, they can automatically get treatment, rehabilitation, disability pensions, etc. And that's going to be part of federal legislation very soon. It's clear, the kind of experiences I was having with the videotape flashbacks were part of this type of intrusive memory flashbacks that you get with PTSD. The only thing I could, when when you listen to a song and the thing sticks in your head and you can't get rid of it, it's the same feeling, except it wasn't there all the time, but when it was there, I couldn't get rid of it. And except the song was just, it's usually a bit boring. This was just causing more and more anxiety and difficulty, loss of sleep and things like that. And when I went to see the psychologist and I was on the medication, I had this profound sense of failure that I'd spent all my life trying to find out more about sexual deviation, and I had this sort of feeling that the best way to protect women and children was to study pedophilia and sexual violence and stuff. And having these videotapes were, to me, a complete failure of all of that. Now, it really wasn't, but I can't tell you how profound that impact and the negative thoughts that came from that then stayed with me until I worked through it over about an 18-month period. Part of PTSD is avoiding situations. My one daughter, both of them are psychologists in some capacity, and no surprise, they decided they wanted to, at presentations, do Bernardo, and then they want to ask me about it, and I would be like this when they were talking to me about it, because any sort of discussion of it would make me feel, would bring on some levels of anxiety, autonomic discomfort. And today I don't feel it as much, but I'm still, even when I talk about it, look at pictures, feel a little bit queasy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the negative emotions. I think that that had a profound effect on me. I had an acute stress reaction. But the negative emotions that came afterwards, I think, and the persistent disturbed cognitions that I had sort of just wore me down over that year or so before I really got help. And it's very, very dangerous, because when you wake up every day and you suddenly lost meaning in what you were doing, but more so you think it's a complete waste of time and it's a total failure, there's no escape from that. You can't sort of say, well, where do I go now, right? But that's how you end up in this hole of these persistent negative cognitions. It's always been interesting to me. When I played competitive golf, I was much better in non-competitive situations, and in competitive situations I always tensed up a little bit, and at times I used beta blockers and stuff to help me. So I've always had a little bit of a hyperarousal response to stress, in this case not just the stress of winning, I guess. But nonetheless, I think that I think that beta blockers work for me, and I think that as you know, I sometimes, and there's all people believe that if you intervene immediately with the acute stress reaction, you stop the traumatic memories being laid down. Beta blockers are one of the things that are helpful with that. And I always wonder about, maybe my autonomic nervous system was a little bit overactive all the time, although it didn't handicap me in any other way other than that. So a little bit about what we know about PTSD, and I'm sort of putting it, I'm not going to review PTSD, I assume you know enough about it. I'm going to sort of try and put it in the context of how it may be viewed in an occupational stress injury context, right? So, McFarlane, who's Australian, I think is one of the people that's done very good work. There are lots of others as well, but I happen to like his work, and it's not just because he's Australian, because I just like what he's done. But one of the things which I think we haven't got our head around very, very well, and we're still researching PTSD, is that we don't quite understand what really happens with it. It's a bit of a mixed picture, right? And so some individuals who cope with trauma at the time of acute stress exposure become symptomatic many years later, right? In my case, it was much more obvious. I had the acute stress reaction, but there are lots of people that don't. That, to me, is a much more dangerous consequence, because what happens, and my friend who's a lawyer who struggled, that's exactly what happened to her. She didn't have anything like I did, and she just went progressively downhill over 12 years, so she was just destroyed, negative. Her marriage relationship was all gone. She was on her own in a miserable, negative, emotional state. No other way to describe it. I think I was in some ways lucky that I had this acute reaction, because it brought attention to what was going on, and I had a lot more of the intrusive symptoms that she had. So again, I think that's an important issue. And, psychiatry on delayed reactions, we're not too good with it. But, some of the independent epidemiological evidence, for example, in the Veterans Readjustment Study, shows that 18% or 19% developed war-related PTSD during their lifetime. 9% current PTSD developed 11 to 12 years later. So this delayed experience. And there are all kinds of arguments about the kind of neurophysiology, neurobiology, and stuff that may explain that. But I think that's not really that important, rather than conceptually that any of us here that are exposed to, in our occupations, problems that may generate trauma-related symptoms, it may creep up on you and have a significant problem later on. There's been a meta-analysis of treatment. Psychotherapy is very helpful. CBT, cognitive processing therapy, rapid eye movement desensitization. In some of the programs like the Occupational Stress Injury Clinic in Ottawa, which deals with the military and the RCMP, they use virtual reality, for example. And there's quite sophisticated treatments psychologically which do quite well, and actually in some studies which show they're actually better than medication. Some that don't. But my sense about it is that you have to do both if you're going to get better, and that's what happened with me. There's been some changes in relation to PTSD coming up in DSM-5, and I think some of them are positive, although it has messed around some of the research from... I've now got an interest in PTSD, so I read about it all the time, and whenever you change the definition, and that's when a DSM-4 scientific advisor to DSM-5, the whole issue is if you change the definition, a lot of the databases and studies that are done previously go out the window. So it's something that has to be thought about carefully. And I think the persistent negative emotional state as a new symptom is very important. And I think it is critical from what I've now become aware of from people. Fortunately, I wasn't involved in any reckless or destructive behavior. But it doesn't require the experience of helplessness or fear. The issue about somatic distress, and in the review article you see, and there's others, there's all kinds of work that shows the somatic consequences of PTSD. I was extremely healthy before I had this. Within the year when I wasn't getting treatment, I had 2 episodes which were later diagnosed as supraventricular tachycardia. The second one, my heart rate was 220 beats a minute by the time I got to the emergency room, so much so that I was no longer pumping blood in through my coronaries, and my troponin and myocardial CPK went up. So effectively, I had a heart attack. Not a heart attack because my coronary arteries weren't patent, but because of what was going on. I spent time with the Cardiac Institute and the arrhythmia specialist, the arrhythmia clinic, and I was on medication eventually, and it was a beta blocker, and eventually went off it. Now that I know more about PTSD, I think this was part of the hyperarousal state which I was suffering with, and I don't think I have supraventricular tachycardia. Since I've been treated, I've never had a problem with my heart, touch wood. And while I was in intensive care, I had angiograms, and my coronaries were fine. These are the typical ones: hypertension, metabolic syndrome, etc. The one thing I didn't know about, which has become also more obvious, and there's now good work on some of the central serotonin and other neurochemical analyses. One of the things that happens with PTSD, that it does affect the immune system. So there's some very, very good studies that now show that as part of the sequelae to PTSD is profound changes with immunity. Well, with me, again, in this out of the blue, my upper arms became paralyzed. I developed a summer cold, summer flu, they thought it was. Within 24 hours, my arms were completely paralyzed. They thought, I went to some friends of mine, and I went to neurology emergency. They thought I had another peripheral neuropathy, the treatment of which is high doses of steroids. They put me on 80 milligrams of steroids for a week and said I would be fine. Day 3, I was worse, and then I thought, something's wrong with this. And I went off to see my friend who was a professor of neurology in Ottawa. And over the next 24, 48 hours, 3 or 4 days, MRIs and nerve conduction studies, I had classic Guillain-Barré. Now, where does that come from? Before I realized that there was effect on the immune response, I was sort of blaming it on the flu vaccine. I think that was wrong. I think it's part of the sequelae. So, I'm sharing that with you because I think my own experiences have been profound in terms of the sequelae of this. So it's a significant condition. Longitudinal studies are important, and it's something that doesn't go away easily, so that many people, long times afterwards, and this is a study that was done in Australia, patients admitted to hospital after traumatic stress exposure, over 1,000 of them, assessments done week 1, etc. Follow-up showed that after 12 months, 70% of persons with PTSD did not have an acute stress disorder. 70% didn't. That's important because if you do have it, at least you've got an idea something happened. If you don't have it, I think it's much more difficult to deal with. And this has been shown up in other studies, so I think it is an important issue. There's also this progression of the condition, and if you look at this related to occupational stress injury, 3 months, 35% at a full diagnosis, 12 months, 49%. So in other words, the danger with this is you get emergence of symptoms over time. So most of people that are in the kinds of occupations where they would be at risk, if you've traumatized at work, they would send you to employment assistance programs, I don't know here, but mostly run by insurance companies, where they'll give you 6 sessions with a counselor, and that would be it. This is not going to help this, right? You need a much more aggressive approach, because if you don't do it, you're going to end up down a rabbit hole like I could have ended up, and with some serious consequences. And that's part of the work that I've been doing in terms of this occupational stress injury, that there's a progressive emergence of symptoms over time. EAP programs need to get their heads around it. They need to, if often EAP programs are not allowed to refer to psychology and psychiatry specialists or occupational stress injury specialized clinics. That should happen. And it should happen early, because if you intervene early, the prognosis is that much better. So you can go from sort of vicarious trauma, people talk about it, burnout and stuff at work, a negative emotional state, and over a period of time, which could be years, into full-blown PTSD. So all of this becomes very relevant as we try and understand it. And these are just some more longitudinal studies that really support this. The other misconception, I think, is that people seem to cope well at the time of acute stress. The theory, contemporaneously, then they should be okay. No, that doesn't mean anything, because what we do know is, although only about 30% of people have an acute stress reaction, or the ones that do are much more likely to develop PTSD and much more severe PTSD. So I kind of got over my acute stress reaction, but not completely, and I was sensitized because of repeated exposure. But contemporaneously, this is a bad measure. Just if somebody copes well at the time and they're full of denial like I was, not good. So stage model is important to get your head around. Repeated exposure, this has been written about, and there has been interesting studies again in Australia about children exposed repeatedly to bushfires, I guess forest fires in Canada, maybe in California. And as there's been repeated exposure, you get repeated sensitization and emergence of PTSD. Again, no particular surprise there, I don't think. So the ability to process traumatic experience decreases with repeated exposure, and that's exactly what happened to me. And the impact of different traumatic events is not necessarily independent of one another, and the prevalence of the traumatic experience has been underestimated. Okay, so it has multiple stages. It's a little bit like a chameleon. If you had told me 10 years ago that forensic mental health people and other people in frontline positions were vulnerable to develop PTSD, I would have laughed you off, right? It's like the first time I heard about adult ADHD, I thought it was a sort of plot by the drug companies to sell more drugs, until I realized I had a nephew who had struggled the whole way through school, and when he got the right treatment, his sister died in a motor vehicle accident. An astute general practitioner said, "I think you have ADHD," God knows why. Put him on Concerta, turned his whole life around, and that convinced me. So, but I need that kind of convincing to take a position. But I'm now totally convinced that lawyers, judges, frontline people, forensic mental health professionals, social workers in child abuse teams, et cetera, all of us are different and have different ways of coping with stress, carry with us some vulnerability because of the nature of the work we're going to do. And some people even print, where they review print media of bad stuff, it affects them. So this is something, so the reason I'm talking to you about it today is that I think that we need to be aware of this. That's a trauma dog. You can have all kinds of trauma dogs, but the good thing about trauma dogs are that doesn't matter when you're in a bad mood and grouchy, your partner will probably be grouchy back at you. Dogs never grouchy, right? They lick you, they're nice, and it's a great thing to have. You have PTSD when you celebrate PTSD Awareness Day by having a party by yourself and smoking weed and getting drunk. You have PTSD when you're more comfortable dealing with flashbacks, anxiety, and nightmares than real-life challenges. You have PTSD when you wake up at 2 a.m. and are thankful for a good night's sleep. You have PTSD when you avoid seeing your friends because they think you're paranoid. You have PTSD when you're overwhelmed with happiness after cutting ties with your family. I've had some issues of stigma. I decided to talk about PTSD. I talked about it publicly on CBC television, and since then I've talked about it openly and in this detail and perhaps even more detail in certain situations. But there's still stigma. I saw a young man and he was in a correctional facility. He was a fourth-year political science student, very bright, and he got accused of harassment with a girlfriend, and there was some harassment there. But what happened was, when he went into the detention center, the local jail, and he ordered the Globe and Mail, and he didn't get it. And he complained to the superintendent of the correctional officers, it didn't go down too well, right? Globe and Mail is Canada's national paper, like the New York Times, right? I think he probably was the only one in the detention center that ordered it. Anyway, there was an incident, and there was a scuffle with some correctional officers, and he fell against a toilet and had a bruised face. And he then came to me for a sentencing evaluation. And he had PTSD. He had developed PTSD. He was reliving the smell of the toilet. He had hyperarousal related to it and whatever. So in the sentencing report that I wrote and sent back to the court, I brought this up and said that I'd be willing to admit him next door into St. Lawrence Valley Correctional Treatment Center, where we have a 25-bed, beg your pardon, a trauma unit run at that time by Colin Cameron, a PTSD expert, where we've got everything available in the whole PTSD spectrum, even nabilone. Do you know what nabilone is? What's nabilone? Nabilone is pharmacological THC. I don't know what you call it here. Pardon? Okay, it's a similar name. Okay, nabilone and whatever you call it here. And we did some of the studies on it, looking at its effects on flashback sleep and stuff like that. I then got a phone call from a judge to say that the Crown Attorney in the case has objected to my report. And I said, why? So she said, you're not going to believe this. She's objecting to your report because your report is biased, because you've been public about the fact you have PTSD, and therefore you're biased in writing your report. So I said, well, if I was a cardiologist and had a heart attack, would that have mattered, right? Anyway, it never went anywhere, but just to sort of show you some of the things that can happen, right? Anyway. All right, so the take-home information, vicarious trauma is people talk about burnout. I never talk about burnout other than it's vicarious trauma of some sort or other, and I think that's the way of conceptualizing. It's a whole other subject. In 2014, just for example, and this had to do with some of the campaigns that I was involved with in terms of public awareness. In a 6-month period, there were 23 first responders, almost all of them, without exception, had PTSD, who killed themselves. So very profound effects. If you look at, and increasingly now, suicidality is being looked at through this lens, and I think it's critical. I think this negative emotional state, misdiagnosed, leading to suicide, may not be bipolar depression, may not be major depressive disorder. It may be vicarious trauma on that spectrum. So that's why I'm bringing it up. So it can have a very profound and problematic effect. So never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has, and that's Margaret Mead. And that's just out of the review article, some of the main points. And I'll be quite happy to talk about questions or comments. Thanks for listening.